Thank you very, very much. And thank you, Ruth Mary, for that nice introduction. I appreciate it. I appreciate everybody being here tonight. And you all got the change of venue understood, and here you are. And there are a couple people, Sarah's one of them, and I saw another one that already heard me speak in my book launch. But I want to assure you, Sarah, that it's not the same. I have changed it somewhat because I knew there might be some people that had already heard me, and I thought, I got to teach them some new tidbits. So that's what I've done. I love this venue because when I wrote Splendid Isolation and I had to go to the archives to get all the information, they were all here. And at that time, I worked with John Hunter and Gretchen Grimminger, who was the curator. And I spent, I would say, about a year and a half just coming here and researching. And Mike likes to tell the story that I'd come on my bicycle in the morning, research for 3 hours, ride my bicycle home, have lunch, and come back. So that made it a lot of fun. But the other reason I like being here is because when I was on the board of directors for FOGI, we met here. We had a big long table there. Some of you know because you were there too with me. And this big table, 3 times this size, was in the middle, and we all sat around. So this is bringing me back to some really sweet memories, and that makes me happy. I often get asked the question, how do you get your ideas for your stories? I guess all authors do. We have a couple other authors in the room too, so I think you all get the same question. And mine varies, but usually a person will approach me and say, I have the next character for you. Now, I'm thinking of the case of Betty Smith. We all know Betty, and Betty came to me one day and said, I know who your next protagonist is going to be. And I said, really, who? She said, Eliza Lucas Pinckney. And I said, okay, who is Eliza Lucas Pinckney? And she kind of looked at me like, you should know this. But of course, being a weaver, she knew this. I didn't. She said, well, she's the first colonist to grow the indigo crop. And I said, really? And she said, in South Carolina. And I said, great. And I still wasn't real convinced. And then she said, and she did it at the age of 17. Okay, I was hooked. That was it. And so here we are. This is the book that she told me I had to write, and I did, and it's called Water to My Soul. I went to South Carolina, to Charleston, after I met with Betty, and I stayed a week and a half, and most of the time I was in the Historical Foundation. They have so much on her. But one of the things that I need to tell you is that when I write about somebody, I try to get a person whose story needs to be told but hasn't been told in novel form. And hers had not been told in novel form. But wouldn't you know it, the year after my book came out, another author wrote The Indigo Girl, which is the same story, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, but she didn't use too much of what I had. And besides, since it's all true, we can use each other's work when they're factual. So that was fine. Sometimes I find my character from visiting a place or going on a holiday. About 5 years ago, Mike and I wanted to go to Key West. We had never been. So before we went, I was looking up things to do, and I saw something about this place called the Dry Tortugas. You get there by boat from Key West, and it takes 2 hours to get there. You stay all day, and then you come back, and it's another 2 hours. So I called them and said, I'd like to make reservations, and they kind of said, you're a little late. This was 2 months before our trip. You're a little late, we're completely full. And I said, okay, what can I do to go standby? And they said, you come to the place where the boat leaves at 6:30 in the morning, the boat leaves at 8, and then you get on a standby list the day of your trip. I said, okay, we'll do that. So we did that. And we were watching and watching and watching. Actually, there were 8 people there before us at 6:30, so they must have come at 6. And so I watched everybody get on except Mike and me. And I knew there were 175 seats. So I looked at Mike and I said, well, let's go out for breakfast. And just then, the man comes around and he goes, Michael Mueller? Mike raised his hand, hands him a ticket. And I'm going, what about me? And he said, and for you, I'm going to write out your ticket. We're going to send 176 instead of 175 today. So that was the beginning of how I started to feel like maybe this is a God thing. Maybe, I mean, I had no idea that I would get a book from this trip. But when we got over there, we were treated to a wonderful tour of the prison. The prison is called Fort Jefferson, but it is a federal prison. So we're over there, and this guide is taking us around, and he starts talking about Dr. Mudd. And we all remember the name Dr. Mudd, but I didn't realize yet that he was a prisoner in a cell right there. So when he continues to tell his story, I looked at Mike, and he looked at me, and it was so weird. At the same time, we went, "Your next book." And it became my next book. So let me show you that one, conceived on vacation. And this one is called A Shadow of Hope. And to me, it was a wonderful story, and I think other people have liked it too. But for Hazel Jane Raines, I discovered her through my friend and yours in the back of the room, Ruth Mary. She and I walked together, and during COVID, we did walk, and I had nothing in mind to write about. And she said, "Well, what's your next book going to be?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Don't you have any idea?" And I said, "I'd kind of like to write about a Georgia woman. And I'd like to do it in the 20th century because I don't have one about a 20th century Georgia woman." And she said, "Oh, okay." And she went home, and about 3 days later, she comes back with a list. And it had 8 or 9 women on it that she had looked into to see if I would like them. And I did. I was so grateful. I had 3 finalists, but I ended up picking Hazel Jane as the one to write about. So as I mentioned earlier, I write books about real people and real events, and they're called historical novels. They're not historical fiction, because what differentiates them between historical novel or nonfiction novel and historical fiction is that I don't add any people or any events that didn't happen. So you have a lot more research to go through to find the information that you need for your book. So I have a little system of how I do them. I depend on research, of course. And I have 3 things: time, diligence, and discipline. I know I'm going to need a lot of time. So I never say I'm going to write this book in 6 months or in 1 year. The book writes itself. And when I'm done writing the book, that's when I'm done. But what I don't do, and I would love to do, is I don't start writing special tidbits that I'm finding in my research and just start writing the book wherever it may be. Maybe some authors do, but that's really hard for me to do. So I have to stick to this regimen of discipline where I have all my notes in a notebook next to my computer, and then I write chapter 1. Because I already know, I'm not making things up as I go along. I know the story, but I have to get it orderly, and that's the only way that I can do it. So this requires a lot of discipline. Of course, it requires time. And like I said, it would be easier to just start writing bits and pieces, but I don't do that. But in the end, the discipline of my organization is what makes me write better. And so people have asked me, how do you do it? And I have an author friend in the back who wants to write his story, and he asked me that. And I said, you've got to give it the time necessary before you start. So today I'm going to introduce you to a woman that I am very fond of. And I'm not going to tell you her whole story because you want to discover that in the writing itself. I learned about her life through the many letters that she wrote, through her journals, and a book that her niece Regina wrote about her after she passed away. And that book was called Pioneer Lady of Flight. Now, what basically this was a compilation of all the letters that Hazel Jane had written to her family and received from her family. But also she had some journal writings in there, and I loved that. And so I was able to see her thoughts as well as what she wrote in letters, and that really worked. I also researched other female pilots because I knew that many of them in her period had the same experiences that she did. And she needed friends in the book, and I used real people who were pilots to be her friends because they did study with her. People ask me, well, what adjectives would you give to her? What is she like? And the first one is inspirational. When I read her story, I read her letters, when I started writing, I thought, this is the kind of book that I would have loved to have read when I was a teenager or a young adult. And so then I said, why don't you write it in that genre, or in that group, which is not teenager, they call it young adult/adult. And it's just about the same as writing an adult book. But I made sure I put in things that young people's minds would like to know about and that would give them confidence in what they were doing. So that inspirational is the first word. The second one is patriotic. She loved her country, she loved to fly, and she wanted to fly for her country. And she was an amazingly patriotic woman in a time when not a lot of women were doing this, but she was. And then finally, remarkable, which is a very overused adjective, but she was remarkable. And when I tell you a little bit about her, I hope you can just see it in what I'm telling you tonight. She loved to break barriers. That was one of her big things. She loved to break barriers, and she broke them on the ground and in the air. She enjoyed the challenges that drove herself to do the impossible, and she achieved success in the very same areas that others had failed because she didn't give up. She just did it again and again until it worked. She was born in Waynesboro, Georgia in 1916 with an unspecified heart condition and chronic asthma. So that's what she started out with and unfortunately carried through her life. When people would ask her about it, she would just shrug and say, "I'm just made up from extra parts." Her family moved to Macon, Georgia when she was in grade school, and she stayed there for her entire education, including receiving a degree in music from Wesleyan College in Macon. Then she followed her dream that her parents promised her she could do when she got her college degree, and that was become a stunt pilot. Now, stunt pilots or barnstormers, or acrobatic flying is what it really is, was such a thrill for her because she could fly up at 5,000 feet, loop down to 1,500 feet, and plummet into a spin. And then she would pull the plane out of the spin at about 500 feet from the ground. Imagine the excitement that the crowds felt watching this. And this gave her so much pleasure. But then she realized that she needed another job. So she got her flying license, and then she was hired in Fort Lauderdale. And she trained pilots who hoped to enlist in the Army and Navy Corps. She and other certified female pilots were very excited because the war was going on, and then they were very surprised and very disappointed when they learned that their own country was not letting female pilots fly in the war. So they were all completely upset, very discouraged, but one day, Hazel Jane and others received a telegram from a woman named Jackie Cochran, who was an American pilot, some of you know of her, famous for her aviation speed records and her Harmon trophies, that she had a few. Jackie, by telegram, said, "Hazel, would you like to come to Britain? Because they're allowing American and Canadian pilots to fly in the war, in the fighter planes." And she said, "Yes, ma'am, I'll be there right away." And she went. 22 American and 2 Canadian pilots working with Jackie became the first American and Canadian females to fly military aircraft. And they did it in Britain. They worked with Jackie's organization called the ATA, which stood for British Air Transport Auxiliary. Their slogan was, "Any aircraft, anytime, anywhere." She was Georgia's first licensed female pilot, and her parents celebrated that very important occasion by giving her a shiny silver dollar inscribed with the words, "In God We Trust." She carried that with her always, and every time she was ready to take off into the air, she would rub it. And I think she would say a prayer. I got the impression that she would pray at that point too. She did have a very strong faith in God, and she would share that whenever she could. Well, Hazel Jane met First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt in England. Mrs. Roosevelt was there in 1942. She knew that the American pilots couldn't fly in her own country, but she knew they could there, so she planned a trip to go over and meet all 26 of them and talk to them. And this she did. She took Winston Churchill's wife, Clementine, with her, and they, like I said, they spoke to every one of the women, but they also invited them to tea at the base in White Waltham, England. So Hazel Jane was so fortunate because she was placed exactly across from Eleanor Roosevelt. And they had a lot in common because of Warm Springs, where the Roosevelts had a home, and that's where she was from, Georgia. She'd been there many times. By 1943, Hazel Jane had flown practically every type of plane built in the United States and in England. She said she had finally fulfilled a realization of her childhood dreams. And now she was ready to realize her new dreams. Her health troubled her throughout her time in Europe and beyond. She was hospitalized in England for 2 weeks, and it was there that she had quite an unusual experience that I would like to share with you. Now, she was in the hospital. A couple of American pilot friends were there with her, and that's where this begins. I was sitting up in bed, chatting with 3 American girls who were visiting me, when, like a shot out of a shell, a middle-aged woman came bursting into my room and said arrogantly, "Where is that gal from Georgia? I want to see some good old Southern blue blood." I sat up taller in my bed and said, "Here she is, so what?" Then this moderately dressed little woman looked intently at me. "Well, honey child, I'm from Virginia, and I know all about us folks from the South. And if you were from Georgia, I know I'm talking to a real lady." Out of the corner of my eye, I could see my friend slipping away from the bed and heading towards the door, and I wondered why. And then she continued, "A real Southern girl would never come off of her dignity and do such an unladylike thing as fly a plane." Ooh, that set me off. "Well now," I began quietly, "let me tell you something about flying. I am of the opinion," and for 10 minutes I did just that, ending with, "I am of the opinion that the women of today are doing a man's job in a woman's world with unfaultable ability and finesse. And if a woman of your integrity cannot see it in that light, she must be a very narrow-minded person indeed." The lady studied me closely, astonished at my outburst. Oh my, that's the first time in my life I have ever had anyone speak to me in such a frank manner. But then she smiled. "However, I do like you, Georgia." I told her it really didn't matter to me whether she liked me or not, since I was merely expressing my feelings. Suddenly it dawned on me just how rude I had been. My mother would have been appalled. "Very well, then, I should go now, but I'll be back tomorrow," she told me, heading toward the door. I called after her, excuse me, are you a Red Cross worker? I'm sorry, I didn't get your name." She paused and smiled pleasantly, and then replied, "Georgia, everyone calls me Lady Astor." I laughed at her sense of humor. "Oh, really now?" As she turned to go, she repeated, "I'll see you tomorrow." When the door closed, my friends fell over themselves laughing. Still irritated, I asked them what was so darn funny. My friend Sue spoke up. "Well, Hazel Jane, even though you would not believe her, that is Lady Astor, and you were extremely disrespectful to her." They recognized her through newspaper articles and photos. "Dear Lord," I moaned, realizing how terribly I had treated her. "Well, I'll never see her again." But Lady Astor kept her promise, and the next day returned with Ambassador Phillips, President Roosevelt's personal representative to India, who was leaving for New Delhi. She said my Canadian doctor, Colonel Walton, had just given her permission to take me home to recuperate into her mansion. Well, apparently, Lady Astor was so taken with Hazel that she invited her to spend the whole Christmas holiday with them in her house, in her beautiful mansion in England. And then Hazel Jane wondered why, until Lady Astor explained that she did this because her 4 sons were all going to be home for holiday, and she was hoping that one of them would perhaps become interested in her. To this, Hazel Jane replied, typical for her, "I'm not ready to fall in love with anyone, not even an Astor. I came to Britain to do a job, and my job has just begun." Lady Astor smiled and nodded. "Well, dear, it really is unusual to find a young girl who wouldn't jump at the chance to marry someone with money and a name." Shortly after this episode, Hazel Jane crashed her Spitfire aircraft into a cottage in rural England. She barely crawled out of the plane with her parachute still intact. She suffered injuries and was not allowed to fly for 3 months. And here are the words she gave to the reporter when the first reporter arrived after the crash. "Well, I'd hoped to get to the village without tearing up the plane, but instead I took the second story from a house and sheared off both wings. I rode through the house and wound up in somebody's front yard, right in the middle of their garden. The house I hit came crashing down around their ears and their teacups." She grinned. "And then I hit a wall and finished off the plane. Only me and the cockpit were left whole." Shortly after she recovered, she did return to the United States and became a part of Jackie Cochran's new group in the U.S. called the Army Air Corps at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. Later, this group was called the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, which you better know as the WASPs. By January 10th, 1944, her 7th year in aviation, she had flown 70 hours in an open plane in cold, cold weather. And I was curious to see if I could find any other of these women whose stories I read, if they had done that, and I did not. So she may have been the only one, and she would, just to have that record, I'm sure. Then she moved on to Pecos, Texas to test pilots on twin-engine planes. In the meantime, her mentor and friend, Jackie Cochran, was busy fighting for military status for all women pilots. She fought hard and she fought long, but due to political sabotage, mostly by male pilots and those who disapproved of women aviators, they lost that fight in Congress, and Jackie's bill was defeated. The WASPs were deactivated and the women were all devastated. These female aviators were now forced to find other employment. They couldn't fly. Hazel Jane found work in her own country and later in Brazil. Jackie Cochran told her and some others that they're looking for aviation instructors in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So she said, "I'll go, but I'm going to learn Portuguese first." And Jackie said, "You don't need to. All of these pilots in this school are fluent in English." And she said, "But out of respect, I want to teach them in their own language." And so she learned Portuguese. She enjoyed a happy romance during her time down in Brazil, and she traveled extensively while she lived there. Hazel and her roommate were in Sao Paulo during Brazil's 1945 presidential elections, and they found themselves immersed in some high drama. But because I want you to read the story, I'm not going to spoil it for you by telling you about it. But I will share with you that she eventually returned to work in her beloved England, where she was really very happy working. As I mentioned earlier, poor health followed her through her life. She never really got rid of it. During her time in England, doctors constantly monitored her, sometimes asking her to visit the hospital every night for checkups. She gave up coffee and alcoholic beverages, and she went to bed by 8 o'clock so that she could get up and fly the first planes out in the morning. Her ears started acting up in Brazil, and Hazel fought to save the hearing in her right ear. This was probably due to the airplane crash she had in 1942. The doctors attributed her back and leg problems to this same crash. Eventually, they gave her a spinal tap and later a back brace. In her own words, I just want to show you now what she says flying meant to her. This was taken from letters, again, to her mother and her sisters. "I was night flying and loving it. I would be all alone with the stars until dawn crept up from the east. At dawn, the quietness of the air feels like a caress. There's nothing quite as luxurious as a dawn sky, blossoming with colors and warming us to our core. But when the noon sun beats down and the skies smile with fluffy clouds, I'm also transported. If I'm flying during the late afternoon, I can't wait for dusk, with the sky drenched in fading light and the nostalgic colors of its own. That's the time of day that I often think about the brave women pilots who preceded me and others, and they opened the doors for us. I remember a quote by Amelia Earhart: "If enough of us keep trying, we'll get someplace." I wrote to my mother and sisters that flying appeals to me because it takes me somewhere else. I have pilots in the room and they're nodding. I like that. Takes me somewhere else. Where was I now? It represents independence and free will, a triumph over gravity. Flying is my chance to excel and to escape from the labyrinth of routine existence. Don't we all need to escape sometime? To seek the euphoria of freedom? Flying provides both. So, mother and sisters, if you ever get a message that I'm in a crack-up and I have been killed, please don't grieve for me more than you can possibly help. Just know that I died the way I wanted to. Hazel Jane once told her family that her greatest personal honor of everything she did was being the first female reserve pilot, returned to active duty in the United States. Okay, I have one more page. Where did it go? Here we are. I got confused here. I was really fortunate to have found and met her family, her great niece and her great nephews. And they said to me, "We have something we want to send to you." It is her photograph album, over 20 years of photographs, where she flew, everything. "Would you like it?" And I said, "Oh my gosh." And they said, "You can use any photos you want." Well, it's a small book, so I couldn't use any photos, but in the middle of the book, towards the end actually, I have many of the photos that they gave me, and a few that I took myself of some places she lived during her childhood. So I just feel so blessed that we got to know them. And when I did a book signing in Macon, Georgia, one of them came, and I returned the book to him, and he said, "We're going to be friends for life. I'm going to look for more things about my auntie that I can give to you to have in your house." And I said, "Oh my gosh, thank you, thank you." So that was really neat. And as you know, with pictures, they are worth 1,000 words. And finally, there's another person I'd like to mention who helped me throughout the writing and the marketing of my story, my wonderful husband, Mike. He always reads my manuscripts and offers suggestions and proofreads the final and the pre-final and the pre-pre-final version. But most importantly, he always encourages me. He even cooks meals when I'm writing at night, and I love that too. But in this book, he did something he'd never done before, and it was very special. He wrote chapter 11. So when you read chapter 11, most of the words are Mike's. I, of course, had to put a couple of mine in there, but it's his story because it's about the preparation of a plane. And I wanted to show how Hazel Jane would prepare her plane before each flight. And Mike was able to walk me and you, the reader, through that. He has a pilot's license, and there's two other white ladies in here that do that I know of. And my friend in the back, Glenn, has one. But so he has the pilot's license, so he knew the right words, but he helped me then understand the thrill when I go up with him and sit in the other seat. I can now feel what Hazel Jane felt, and I never had before. So that's really exciting to me that now that I've written this book and my husband helped me with it, I feel the euphoria that I read to you that she feels like. Thank you, Michael.